This video is sponsored by World of Tanks. Roll out into the combat zone to do battle against millions of players on PC completely free to play, with over 600 light, medium and heavy tanks, destroyers and artillery from 11 nations. Engage across open fields, climb hills, sneak through forests, tear across deserts, and pick your battles in urban and industrial zones in over 40 battle arenas, with regular feature and content updates. Authentic models and vehicle characteristics give you a feeling of historical accuracy, making you feel like a real tank commander taking part in a furious armoured offensive like the Battle of the Bulge. Modify and upgrade your tank, and create a steel beast ready for any challenge. Download World of Tanks today using the link in the description. During the registration, use the code ONCEUPONATANK to get a free 7 days of premium account, the tank Matilda Black Prince, 1 garage slot and 100% crew, and 2 rental tanks for 10 battles each, the mighty Tiger 131 and the mightier Sherman Firefly. On the 28th of January 1945, the last Wehrmacht troops of the Führer's last great Western offensive staggered back into Germany. They had just been defeated after 43 days of bitter fighting. Despite initially gaining the upper hand thanks to the element of surprise, the Allies reacted quickly and halted the offensive, before driving the enemy back. The two sides combined suffered 200,000 casualties during the winter campaign. But could the German offensive have ever succeeded in its dash to Antwerp? The Führer's ultimate goal was to cut off the Commonwealth armies in the Netherlands in a large pocket, and force the Allies to the negotiating table so he could turn his attention east to the approaching Red Army. However, this was a fantasy which had no bearing in reality. Simply put, it was pretty much impossible for Germany to have won the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The fate of the German offensive, which began on the 16th of December, was sealed before the attack even began. The Battle of the Bulge showed how the economic and industrial front had just as much, if not more impact on the outcome of the war than tactical victories on the battlefield. Germany's economic situation in comparison to its enemies would be its downfall. However, that is not to say that the Reich's war economy was in dire straits even as late as September 1944. Minister of Armaments and War Production Albert Speer ordered a study to determine whether Germany could sustain the war effort if it could only draw raw materials from Germany itself, northern Italy, and parts of Hungary and what is now Croatia. His staff concluded that the current level of war production could continue at a high rate until January of 1946, at which point the country would run out of stockpiles and resources. In theory, Germany would be able to hold out despite its circumstances. However, this report failed to take into consideration not just the effect of Allies bombing, which forced the dispersal of factories across the Reich, but Nazi mismanagement of the war economy. This resulted in a more inefficient system for producing munitions and war materials. German coal production was a victim. Before the war, Germany had the most mechanized mines in Europe, along with an efficient transportation system. German coal output per man-hour exceeded that of the UK by 1/3 and was double that of neighbouring France. When Poland, France, the Low Countries and Eastern Europe fell, the German theory was that they would have an untouchable war industry. However, Germany's victories in the first years of the war exposed the incompetence of the Nazi bureaucracy. Having conquered mainland Europe, German leadership realised they did not have enough rolling stock nor well-maintained railways to exploit their occupied territories. Furthermore, these defeated countries were now entirely reliant on German raw materials to sustain their economies, which the Führer needed to support his war effort. Due to the Allied blockade and lack of imports coming into Nazi-occupied Europe, the German Reich was forced into sharing its precious resources with its new vassal states, lest their economies collapse. Rather than heating the homes of Berlin or fueling military factories, German coal was instead heavily exported to Poland and France. Another perfect example of Nazi inefficiency can be seen in aircraft production. Although Germany had a similar number of workers to the United States, enough stockpiles to produce aircraft at a high level, and a growing synthetic fuel industry, a large inefficiency gap existed between the two. Germany and the United States each had around 2 million workers specifically tasked with producing aircraft from 1943 to 1944, but US factories churned out 127,747 combat aircraft, compared to 55,675 for the Luftwaffe in the same time span. British aircraft production also matched German production. Factories in the UK itself built 52,701 airframes, nearly outproducing Germany despite severe worker shortages and the need to import most raw materials from abroad. But importantly, further airframes were built across the British Empire in factories untouched by German bombing, notably another 16,000 in Canada. Although not directly involved in the Battle of the Bulge, but certainly affecting its outcome at a strategic level, British naval production vastly outnumbered and outproduced German naval power. And with the initiative won in the Battle of the Atlantic, arguably the most important front of the Second World War, the naval blockade of Germany was a chokehold over its limited resources. 1/3 of all merchant shipping in the world was British, with the US contributing a vital 2,700 Liberty ships. Where Germany was blockaded, the Western Allies could import material and project land and air power much more freely. Again indirectly of the Battle of the Bulge itself, but obviously hugely important strategically, was the small matter of the Eastern Front. On top of its own large industrial capacity and abundance of oil, massive amounts of British and American supply were sent to the USSR, draining further German military capacity which could have been used in the West. The extensive usage of slave labourers from occupied territories also had a negative impact on German production, as coercion did not result in a better product. The president of the Douglas Aircraft Company, Donald Douglas, summed it up after the war. Here's proof that free men can outproduce slaves. A resounding Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, along with the success of the combined bomber offensive, reduced Germany's industrial power to the point where any major offensive would be doomed to failure. The Allies' hard-won control over the Atlantic Ocean shipping lanes meant their vast industrial power could be deployed anywhere in Europe and around the world. Germany had no such ability, having lost the Battle of the Atlantic in decisive fashion. Therefore, the Reich was entirely reliant on raw materials from its occupied territories inside Europe. This also made Sweden a key geopolitical ally for Germany, as it was the only country which could import a sufficient amount of iron ore to sustain the war effort. The combined bomber offensive was a war-winning endeavour in many ways, but the decision to eventually target Germany's oil industry played a massive role in the Battle of the Bulge. At the Casablanca Conference in 1943, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris identified the Reich's oil supply as a key target for the combined bomber offensive. However, it was assigned lower priority compared to the need to destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter production facilities. Once the Luftwaffe pilot corps had been ground down, the bombing campaign expanded to include Germany's oil facilities, including synthetic refineries, the Ploiest oil fields in Romania, and key transportation hubs. These targets were vulnerable now that German fighters were unable to stop the waves of Allied bombers. The commander of Strategic Air Forces in Europe, Karl Spaatz, spearheaded a devastating campaign which wrecked the Reich's fuel supply. In 1943, Allied bombers dropped 235,075 tons of munitions on German fuel production facilities, a figure which jumped to 921,990 tons in 1944 alone. German fuel production at the beginning of 1944 was approximately 1.2 million tons per month. By the end of the year, it was 300,000. This 67% decline starved Germany's armed forces of the fuel it needed to keep the war going. The round-the-clock bombing of transportation hubs also prevented refined fuel from reaching the front, which left Wehrmacht units chronically short of fuel. Nonetheless, Germany concentrated the last of its fuel reserves for Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive. Even then, it was only enough to support the beginning of the attack, and the plan rested upon forward units capturing Allied fuel depots intact. This was a difficult task made even harder by the Wehrmacht's gas-guzzling heavy tanks, such as the King Tiger and the Panther. Professor Phillips O'Brien of the University of St Andrews states that the saga of Kampfgruppe Peiper during the Battle of the Bulge demonstrated the folly of this exercise. Peiper's heavy tanks broke through the American lines, but only made it about 20 miles before its vehicles ran out of fuel. The immediate lack of fuel was compounded by the inability to bring fuel reserves forward, thanks to the Allied bomber offensive. The oil campaign had a massive impact on the outcome of the battle. The need to disperse factories to prevent against Allied air attack meant that German workers in small, cramped underground facilities could not keep pace with their American counterparts, who assembled airframes in large concentrated industrial complexes, free from the same threat of air attack against them. Messerschmitt estimated that dispersal caused a 50% drop in production for 1944 alone. Although dispersal hurt German production, it was necessary to protect workers and machinery from air attack. Thus, the Reich's Ministry of Armaments was forced into this unhappy decision by the bombing campaign. While dispersal ensures the safety of workers from bombing, it has a disastrous effect on the war economy. Steel was vital to the war effort, and in terms of raw production, Germany appeared to be producing more than enough to supply its armed forces. When the war began in 1939, German steel production sat at 23,733,000 metric tons, which expanded to a high of 34,600,000 in 1943. Unlike the Allies, the German steel industry seemingly had a key advantage in sending this output straight to the military factories, rather than exporting to foreign markets. However, this meant little if the steel could not be transported efficiently or used in a concentrated industrial environment. The specific impact of the steel industry dispersal can be seen in tank production. From 1943 to 1944, Germany built 30,197 panzers in those 2 years during the peak of its industrial output. This paled in comparison to the United States, which produced 57,555 tanks, including 37,198 in 1943 alone. British tank production for the war was a further 27,528, while Canada built a further 5,200. Other factors affect those figures, such as the more complex design of German armoured vehicles, which increased production time, but there is no doubt that the comparative industrial capacity of the Reich versus the Western Allies hurt the Wehrmacht's battlefield performance. This leads to a simple conclusion. Even if the fantasy scenario had happened, a mystery fuel supply had been found, and German tanks had managed to fight their way through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and capture Antwerp, they would have been grossly outnumbered and eventually overrun by endless numbers of British, American, Canadian, and Polish tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Had the Wehrmacht sealed the pocket around the Commonwealth armies, it's highly improbable that the weakened German forces would have been able to crush their enemy. Celebrated German tank design accounted for little when its panzers were outnumbered 3-1 on the battlefield, and by even more in reserves, all while their supply chains were being heavily outgunned from the air. It's more likely that the German forces would have been destroyed in a pocket of their own. The Ardennes offensive relied more on luck than it did on military prudence. Almost everything would have to go right for the attack to be successful, which violated one of the key axioms of war: no plan survives first contact with the enemy. The Führer gambled on 3 key aspects going his way during the battle. The capture of fuel supplies, the element of surprise. He hoped that the shock of the assault would paralyse Allied leadership, leaving them unable to react in time. And poor weather. The offensive would only succeed if overwhelming Allied air power could be grounded by snow and fog. As for point 2, despite achieving the element of surprise, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower immediately recognised the danger of the offensive and sent reinforcements to the area. The paralysing shock the Führer was hoping for never materialised. Perhaps most important was the third element, the weather. The Allies had enjoyed air superiority over the European continent for months, with tactical air forces savaging German units on the front and supply trains. In Normandy, the Wehrmacht discovered just how difficult it would be to launch a major offensive without air cover during Operation Lüttich. On the 7th of August 1944, German armoured units attacked the US Third Army which had broken out of the beachhead during Operation Cobra. They achieved surprise only to be hounded by Allied fighter bombers. On one afternoon alone, RAF Typhoons flew 294 sorties and fired 2,088 rockets against the German units. The attack failed with heavy casualties and led to disaster as the German units involved in Operation Lüttich were eventually surrounded in the Falaise pocket. Panzer crews were entirely without air support throughout the battle, as Allied fighters intercepted Luftwaffe aircraft far behind the front line, sometimes before the German pilots had even left their airfields. It was of paramount importance to neutralise the threat of Allied air power during the Ardennes offensive. The weakened Luftwaffe could no longer offer substantial resistance, though not for lack of effort. German industry in 1944 had produced 28,926 fighters, a 150% increase over the previous year. By the time of the offensive, 85% of the Luftwaffe's aircraft was engaged in defence of the Reich, rather than fighting on the Eastern Front or in the Mediterranean. Factory workers in Germany peaked at nearly 10.9 million, although many were slave labourers. Most importantly, the Reich had had some success in creating a domestic supply of synthetic aviation fuel, which lessened its dependence on Romanian and Hungarian oil. Yet none of this mattered in the face of the Allied industrial juggernaut. Although Germany was producing more fighters than ever before, they were also being shot out of the sky at unsustainable rates. In January of 1944, the average rate for lost or damaged Luftwaffe aircraft was already 52.4%. By June, it was a catastrophic 96.3%. Attrition of the pilot corps led to a death spiral for the Luftwaffe, which could not train pilots fast enough to effectively fly the aircraft being produced. By the end of 1944, the German Air Force lost 15,327 aircraft in combat missions, with over 80% of these fighting the Western Allies over Europe. The Luftwaffe was a spent force when the Ardennes offensive began, which is what had led the Führer to order the attack in bad weather. The struggles of Germany's war economy trickled all the way down to the individual soldier on the battlefield. For the all-important panzer units, the destruction of transportation delayed the delivery of support assets such as recovery vehicles, repair tools, ammunition and spare parts. Field hospitals were impacted by a growing lack of ambulances, fuel for heating, medical tools and rations. All of this created a snowball effect which hindered the Wehrmacht when it needed its strength the most in the Ardennes. Conversely, the Western Allies could not only outproduce battlefield assets, but also support assets to keep those frontline units in the fight. Maintenance vehicles could repair knocked out tanks and have them back in the fight the next day. Field hospitals could patch men up and send them back out. Advances in tactical technology, for example vehicle tactical radios, slickened the Allied war machine at the operational level. Bailey bridges were produced in vast quantities to conduct river crossings. Mulberry harbours were constructed to bring supply ashore from the vast numbers of merchant vessels onto vast numbers of supply trucks that brought the material to the front line. Meanwhile, German supply was still being hauled to the front line by horse, and knocked out frontline assets would often just have to be abandoned, with the hope of new assets arriving from the factory at some point. The factory, which had been razed to the ground by Allied bombing, and with no rail connections left standing to get it to the front anyway. In conclusion, the German war economy was completely ill-suited to support the Battle of the Bulge, and frankly, the Second World War in general. Commander-in-Chief West Gerd von Rundstedt and Army Group B Commander Walter Mördl proposed a smaller offensive that was far more realistic given Germany's lack of resources, but the Führer insisted on his grand vision. War at this global scale is won at the industrial level, and less importantly by tactical victories in the field. With the benefit of post-war research and data, we now know that a German victory in the Battle of the Bulge was a mere fantasy. While it is clear that young men sent to Europe to fight fascism showed courage and gave their lives to defeat the enemy in front of them, the Ardennes campaign was won far before December of 1944 by the industrial might of the Allies. There is an argument to be had about whether Germany could have ever won the Second World War in Europe, or whether it was doomed from the start and a fantastic waste of lives and everyone's time, but that's for another video. Thanks to World of Tanks for sponsoring this video. Roll out into the combat zone to do battle against millions of players on PC completely free to play using the link in the description.